Welcome back, and thank you for joining us for module number 3. In this session, we're going to take a closer look at how to write quality goals. And in case it's been a period of time since you saw the first 2 modules, it might be a good idea if we take just a few minutes to make a review. Is that okay with you, Carol?
Sure.
You know, Carol, I really liked your reference to the Aristotle quote, the one that kicked us off in module number 1. That's really what it's all about, isn't it?
In a nutshell, yes. Aristotle is credited with saying the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And a lot of times the way we have done IEPs is we've looked at each of the little parts, or we've filled in the form piece by piece instead of thinking about the IEP as a plan and as a process. So we have a product, which is the individualized plan that is reasonably calculated to result in educational benefit. That is what our ultimate bottom line is about. That's what we want to create. But how do we get there? We get there by planning and using a process that looks at data in order to determine what is needed for the student to benefit from education. It's kind of like a GPS. Using a GPS, you have to know where you want to go. You put in your data, and it has to be good data, about where you currently are, and it creates a map. As you go along, new opportunities arise. You might come to a barrier, and you have to adjust. And when you arrive at your first goal, which is often the end of the first year, but maybe it could be in the middle of the year, you need to choose a new goal, and you kind of start over again with the process. So for the IEP process, it's about starting with that desired outcome or the instructional result we want to achieve. One of the reasons it's important to start with standards is because we need to know what's expected for students to be able to be successful on those standardized tests, to be successful in a general curriculum, and we want to start with that in mind. Where do we want to go? We want to look at our present levels by looking at what are the expectations in the general curriculum versus the students' current skills and knowledge to identify areas of instructional need. That leads us to the goals, that leads us to instructional services and programs, and then to implementing the services and monitoring progress. To review, again, why standards-driven curriculum, or why do we think about standards? Why have they become so important? One is to provide instructional accountability so that everyone knows what the expectations are, and we're developing instruction accordingly. If we use our standards to identify goals for the IEP, chances are our instruction will be more able to be supported in the least restrictive environment for students with disabilities. It will allow for greater access to the general curriculum, but also more meaningful access to the general curriculum. We don't want to just plop students into a general classroom unless it's a meaningful experience for them. And it creates a structure for linking the IEPs to the general curriculum, which is a requirement in IDEA that we consider that general curriculum when doing the IEPs. Standards-driven IEPs are essential for students in order to achieve educational benefit, which is defined in many cases by the ability to get a diploma, which is based on the standards. It promotes a single system of education. It encourages greater consistency across schools and districts. It sets higher standards for kids. It's best for all kids. That was kind of the summary of the first 2 in terms of just giving the background of why why standards are important to IEPs. So what does it mean to connect IEPs to standards? It means that we refer to the standards in order to determine the expectations of the grade level. And then we use those standards as a guide to determine what it is most important for the student to be able to learn to do to be successful in the general curriculum. And finally, we conduct an analysis to determine the gap between the grade expectations and the student's current skills and knowledge in order to be able to identify our present levels of performance. In one definition of general education curriculum is that it's the full range of courses, activities, lessons, and materials that routinely are used by the general population of a school. And by access, we mean participation in the knowledge and skills that make up the general education curriculum. And notice that it means participation in the knowledge and skills. That's where the meaning is. It's not just sitting in the regular classroom. It's actually being able to feel successful, to participate alongside with their peers. We did a review of the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance in Module 2. And these are areas that define special education and instruction and services that are going to be determined by conducting an analysis that looks at the gap between grade expectations and current knowledge and skills, and determining how the disability affects the participation in the general education.
And you know, Carol, as I recall, the PLAFF's going to address both achievement and instruction. Is that right?
Well, they are to address both academic and functional performance. So in the past, we've only worried about academic performance. And this past reauthorization of the IDEA included this requirement to look at functional performance. So that means that we're not just looking at whether or not students are just moving along and gaining the academic requirements or expectations of the general curriculum, but also whether or not they're achieving the behavioral and social expectations of the general curriculum. And so we see in the present levels that statement of the child's present level, the child's present performance, and then how the disability affects that child's involvement and progress in the general curriculum. There are three major components, just as a reminder of the present levels. First is academic performance, second is functional performance, and third is how the disability affects performance in the general education curriculum. And we did a lot of conversation about examples that illustrate these three components when we were in that first or in the second module. The next slide shows the flow, the general curriculum expectations compared with current skills. That helps us identify areas of instructional need that then leads to what we actually put on the IEP form. There's lots of conversation before we actually write anything on that form.
Okay. So what I'm hearing you say then, you're implying that there's a natural link then between the present level statements and the annual goals?
Absolutely. This module is going to talk, we're really going to talk a lot about the annual goals.
Okay.
It is that discussion in the present levels statements that does lead to the measurable goals. And in fact, you know, when we talk about IEPs connected to standards, we tend to think that we're going to look at the goals to determine whether or not that IEP is actually connected to the standards. But it really is the present levels that have to be connected to the standards. And if we do a really great job of really doing our analysis well in that present level of performance component of the IEP process, the measurable goals are going to fall out fairly naturally. So what are measurable goals? They are statements that describe what a student can reasonably be expected to accomplish within a 12-month period in the student's special education program. That definition is really important. There are a couple of key components. What a student reasonably can be expected to accomplish. The second one is within a 12-month period, so we're looking at a year at a time. And the third is this is about what is going to be accomplished in the student's special education program. So when we come back, we'll take a good look now at what are measurable goals.